Good morning. My name is John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I just want to thank all of you for coming out for this great occasion. I'd like to begin our program by asking for a round of applause for the Los Angeles Police Department Band for that great beginning to today's program. I'd like now to introduce the Ronald Reagan Marine Corps League Detachment number 597, who will parade the colors. I ask that you please stand for the colors and remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance and our national anthem. Parade the colors. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Retire the colors.
Right, face. Forward, march.
Thank you. Please be seated. Before we go further, there are a few people in the audience that I'd like to recognize this morning. In fact, several people. And although our speakers will be introduced shortly, we are honored to have two of their better halves with us this morning. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Charlotte Schultz and Ursula Mies. Of course, we have Elton and Janice Galgley, who have been so supportive of the library for so long. Elton, Janice. The sculptor of the statue we will be unveiling later today, Doug Van Hout and his wife, Nancy. Of course, the director of the Reagan Library, Duke Blackwood. Duke. A special thank you to our friends of our hometown of Simi Valley, including Eric Levitt, Bob Huber, Keith Mashburn, and longtime friend associated with the city, Mike Siddell. Gentlemen. All of the elected officials with us today from Ventura County and from the cities of Simi Valley, Calabasas, Camarillo, Moore Park, Thousand Oaks, and Westlake Village. Gentlemen and ladies, thank you for coming. It's also my honor to recognize a handful of people in the audience that served President and Mrs. Reagan in both the White House and their post-presidential lives. We're grateful for their service and their attendance today. There's several, but if you know that you're one of these spectacular people, if you'll please stand. These are folks like Joanne Drake. Joanne, where are you? Joanne and those that have been with the Reagans for decades. Thank you so much for coming. Lastly, it's my honor to introduce a small group of people in the audience that have been with the Reagan Library since it opened 25 years ago. These hardworking and dedicated individuals have helped make the Reagan Library what it is today. And as I say your name, if you'd please stand. From the Reagan Library, Kelly Barton, Steve Branch, Lisa Jones, and Kate Sewell. Thanks so much. From the Reagan Foundation, Carolyn Mente. Carolyn, where are you? There you are. And from our wonderful docent staff, Doris King, Rosemary Licata, Ann Ledeen, Margie Oxner, Donna Patterson, Liz Penner, and Peggy Sadler. When President and Mrs. Reagan dedicated the Reagan Library 25 years ago today, I know they had hopes and aspirations of what it would become. And although we have changed and grown a lot over the past quarter century, at heart we are still the same. A place and a group of people dedicated to continuing the legacy of our nation's 40th president and in sharing with the world his principles of individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. There are a lot of things I could say about what has transpired these past years and what we're planning for the future, but I'll leave that to our special guests today. We are so incredibly honored to have these four speakers to reflect on the legacy of Ronald Reagan and the presidential library that bears his name. Our first speaker today, David Ferriero, was confirmed as the 10th Archivist of the United States on November 6, 2009. As part of his many duties, David oversees all 13 of the current presidential libraries. And today just would not have been complete without him here with us. I'd also like to add, with Veterans Day just around the corner, that all four of our speakers served in our nation's military. David, yes, yeah. David served in the United States Navy. Our second speaker, Ed Meese, is an Army man. He spent much of his adult life working for Ronald Reagan. Perhaps best known as U.S. Attorney General during President Reagan's second term, Ed's service to our 40th president stretched from California at the governor's mansion in 1966, where he served as chief of staff, to the White House in 1981 in the role of counselor to the president, before he went on to the Department of Justice 4 years later. Ronald Reagan once remarked at a press conference, a famous one, that if Ed Meese is not a good man, then there just are no good men. And he was right. Our third speaker served in the United States Marine Corps. Pete Wilson has spent more than 30 years in public service, beginning in 1966 when he was elected to the California State Assembly. In 1971, he was elected mayor of San Diego. He remained mayor until he was elected United States Senator in 1982 and re-elected in 1988. He served as the governor of California, a great one I might add, from 1999, which included when this library was opened. It's also worth noting that Pete served as the MC, did a better job than me, at the Reagan Library's opening 25 years ago, and it's just terrific to have him with us here today. Pete continues to serve Ronald Reagan by sitting on the board of trustees of the Reagan Foundation and Institute, and we appreciate his continuous support and guidance every day. Also on our board is our last speaker today, Secretary George Shultz, who also served in the United States Marine Corps. Secretary Shultz has had a distinguished career in government, in academia, and in the world of business. He is one of two individuals who have held 4 different federal cabinet posts. He has taught at 3 of our country's great universities, and for 8 years, he worked first as an executive, eventually becoming president at Bechtel, one of our nation's foremost engineering and construction companies. As President Reagan's Secretary of State, he played a key role in implementing a foreign policy that led to the successful conclusion of the Cold War. As President Reagan liked to say about how he correctly envisioned the end of the Cold War, quote, "We win, they lose." In great part, we have Secretary Shultz to thank for that. Secretary Shultz also was responsible for the development of a strong relationship between the United States and the countries of the Asia-Pacific region, including China, Japan, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. As a special treat this morning, we have interwoven portions of President Reagan's speech from 25 years ago today in between each of our speakers' remarks. We selected remarks that we believed were fitting for each speaker. So with that, Mr. President, would you care to continue the program from here?
Together we gather for a single purpose, to give to the American people and the world a presidential library. There is understandably a great temptation to look back, to remember, to share warm and fond memories, and to reflect on the events which brought us here. And as we do, I hope we do not unduly focus on one man, one political party, or even one country. Instead, our focus should be on the enduring fundamental principles of life that ennoble mankind. Ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presidents have built libraries, and amidst the surroundings that have shaped their characters and molded their values. From West Branch, Iowa, to the Simi Valley of California, these institutions reflect the genius of the American people for self-government. Within their walls are housed millions of records for scholarly interpretation, along with thousands of objects that give both solid and symbolic substance to this nation's highest office and to the 40 men who have occupied it since Washington took his oath.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 10th Archivist of the United States, the Honorable David Ferriero.
Good morning and greetings from Washington. I'm honored to be here this morning to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. The mission of the National Archives is to collect, to protect, and to preserve the records of the United States government and make them available so that the American public can hold this government accountable and learn from our past. We are the final destination for the most important records of the United States, and today that collection has over 13 billion sheets of paper, 43 million photographs, miles and miles of film and video, and more than 5 billion electronic records, the fastest growing part of our collection. These records start with the oaths of allegiance signed at Valley Forge by George Washington and his troops and go all the way up to the tweets that are being created as I am speaking in the White House. The National Archives also, as you just heard, administers the network of presidential libraries from Herbert Hoover to George W. Bush. We now have 13 libraries in total with more than 780 million pages of textual documents and almost 700,000 museum objects underway to move the Obama presidential records and materials to Chicago as we prepare for the next presidential library. As you know, presidential libraries are not libraries in the usual sense. They're archives and museums bringing together the documents and artifacts of a president, his administration, and his family, and presenting them to the public for study and discussion without regard for political considerations or affiliations. Franklin Roosevelt's founding intent was to have the presidential libraries located throughout the country where scholars and school children could learn about their government, the presidency, and the importance of public service. Presidential libraries serve many purposes. On the day this library was dedicated, more than 6 million pages of documents related to the Reagan administration were released to the public. And since that time, the archival team here has processed and opened an additional 18 million records, making them available online and in the library's research room. As President Reagan acknowledged 25 years ago in his remarks at the dedication ceremony, while access to these materials by students and scholars is essential, most of those who enter these doors are not academics. They are, he said, ordinary people of all ages, backgrounds, and political persuasions, eager to examine their past and to explore a history not always taught in school. For them, this institution will be a time capsule of American growth and greatness, covering more than a single presidency, honoring more than a single president. Here, visitors will have a chance to tour and study at their leisure the accelerating changes in a fast-forward world. I wish to thank all of the library and museum staff here in Simi Valley for their tireless efforts to fulfill the President's vision by improving the experience of our researchers, ensuring the protection of our valued holdings, and greeting hundreds of thousands of visitors to this unique museum. I'm fortunate to oversee a wonderful staff who works across the country for the National Archives, a diverse group of talented individuals who love what they do and do it well, which is one of the reasons I have such respect for these people. People I meet in my travels often say that the National Archives holds wonderful treasures in its vaults. Among those treasures, however, are the ones who go home at night, our staff. I'd also like to express my appreciation to the Reagan Foundation for their continued support of this library and museum and for the resources and expertise they contribute to this unique public-private partnership, which has led to a number of crowning achievements, including the redesign of the permanent exhibit galleries in 2011, the building of the Air Force One Pavilion, the development of a number of blockbuster temporary exhibits, and the protection of 300 acres of land surrounding this magnificent site. Without the support of the presidential foundations, the National Archives and the presidential libraries would be unable to deliver the rich programming, digital access, and museum experiences now being enjoyed by millions of visitors across the country each year. The Reagan Library, perched high on this beautiful hilltop, is a shining example of how two institutions working together as partners can have a dramatic impact on the community as well as the country. The Reagan Library and Museum is the most visited within our presidential library system and offers innovative educational programming, including the Discovery Center and the Situation Room experience. Presidential libraries bring the presidency to the people, inspiring new generations to civic engagement and to consider pursuing careers in public service. And as we celebrate this quarter century of remarkable achievements and look forward to the next chapter in the Reagan Library's history, I applaud the efforts of all those at the Library Foundation and in this community who have supported over the past 25 years. I am so proud to be associated with your past and your success.
Something else I learned, and that every generation of young Americans must discover for themselves, I learned to admire the entrepreneurial spirit of this pioneering land, where everyone has a chance to push out the boundaries of life. All this and more will greet visitors to this library and museum.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 75th Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Edwin Meese.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to join in this 25th anniversary celebration of the Reagan Library. I certainly want to start by commending John Hybush, Joanne Drake, Duke Blackwood, and all those who have worked so hard over the years and the great job that they've done in making this an outstanding monument to our President Ronald Reagan and to his great legacy that he has left for generations to come. You know, Ronald Reagan's optimism and cheerfulness, I think, inspired a nation at a time when things were looking down. And his leadership literally, as has been pointed out already, changed the world. One of President Reagan's defining characteristics, really, was his sense of humor. He was well known for the jokes that he liked to tell, and occasionally the jokes he liked to play. I had an experience like that myself. It was 1985, and I'd just been appointed Attorney General of the United States. And I was flying to California from Washington, D.C. with the President aboard Air Force One. Also on the plane was Bill Smith, who had been my immediate predecessor, and he was now out of office returning home. And so the two of us were put in a section of the plane, which many of you have seen when you went through it. It's right behind the President's cabin. There's a little cabin that's reserved for members of the cabinet. So we were sitting there. It happened that we'd had to get up rather early that morning to make the plane, and so we got pretty tired, and as the plane was moving towards California, we fell asleep. Well, the President happened to go by, and he noticed that, and immediately summoned the White House photographer, who, unbeknownst to us, took a picture of the two of us fast asleep. Well, I didn't know anything about it, of course, until a week later, and I got a copy of the photo directly from the hand of Ronald Reagan, and he had inscribed the photo as follows. He said, "See, dear Ed, see, I told everyone you could do Bill's job, and here's the proof." Signed, Ronald Reagan. Well, later on, Lynn, I had the privilege of being one of the founding directors of the foundation, and I had the pleasure of working directly with Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan in the development, really, of the library and the museum. You know, both the President and his wife were very directly and intimately involved in every aspect of this project, in accepting the site originally, in selecting an architect, in approving the plans, and in monitoring the construction itself as it went along. And then, of course, we came to this great day on the 4th of November, 1991. Now, the 4th of November is very important as a date for Ronald Reagan. It was the date that he was elected governor of California. The 4th of November was the date that he was elected President of the United States. And of course, it is the 4th of November today. And so it's appropriate that we recognize this particular anniversary a quarter of a century. You know, one of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan's desires as they were working on this library project was to be sure that this edifice reflected, as Ronald Reagan said in those words you heard a few minutes ago, the enduring fundamental principles of life that ennoble mankind and the genius of the American people for self-government. As you can see today, the library and the museum have definitely fulfilled Ronald Reagan's vision of what it should be. Here you find out the history of a man, but also you find the achievements of a people who accomplished so much in the 8 years in the 1980s. Our country recovered from a historic economic crisis. It began one of the longest periods of economic growth in the history of the country. It was a growth not only of economic growth, but technological progress. One of the great things that Ronald Reagan said when he was governor, and he was challenged by the students who claimed that he couldn't know what they knew or understand them because that he didn't have, they didn't have, or rather, as he said, the kid said that his generation didn't have things like television, things like coast-to-coast travel, and it listed about a dozen different things that had developed during the course of the 20th century. And so Ronald Reagan said, no, son, we didn't have them, we invented them. Well, he really did believe that in all that America had accomplished during that period of time. And as you heard, it won the Cold War and brought freedom to millions of people around the world. It also reaffirmed the principles of liberty, free enterprise, and constitutional self-government that began with our nation's founders over 2 centuries ago. And if Ronald Reagan would like to be remembered for anything, it is that he revived the spirit of the Constitution during his time in office. Well, in planning for the dedication 25 years ago, there were 2 themes that were particularly mentioned by Ronald Reagan. One was the unity of the nation, and this was symbolized by all the other living presidents joining him here, as well as by leaders from a variety of walks of life who participated in that ceremony. The other theme, which is indicated and continues today, was the appreciation for this community, particularly the gratitude for the many people who had worked in the development of the library and then was carried on with the many docents and the other volunteers who have worked so hard to make this library and museum a success. As I've been here and talked to the docents and gone around, I've often admired the great amount of knowledge that they have and the hard work that they do to prepare for their jobs, and how the fact that they have so much knowledge of the Ronald Reagan story that they can pass on, particularly to the school children who come here. They make the exhibits literally come alive to all of the visitors to the museum, and they're the fountains of information for those who seek to learn more about one of our greatest presidents. The late historian Rufus Fears said that there were 4 qualities that distinguished a statesman from a mere politician. He said they were a moral compass, a bedrock set of principles, a vision for leadership, and an ability to communicate the vision to others and to gain their support. Ronald Reagan was a true statesman with all of those qualities, and evidence of that distinction will continue to be on display at this magnificent library for all generations to come. For that, we can be thankful.
Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 36th Governor of the State of California, the Honorable Pete Wilson.
Director Ferriero, General Meese, Secretary Schultz, and I might say that I would be terribly remiss if I did not thank, as well as recognize, the Executive Director of this great library, John Highbush, Joanne Drake. Don't keep that stifled. If you let it out. Let it out. No, really, it's not healthful if you keep it bottled up. It produces stress. If not for you, for me. Well, it does seem interesting, to say the least. Ed told you about why the 4th of November is such an important date in the story of Ronald Reagan. And yes, it was 25 years ago. Suddenly they have passed like that. But it seems like just yesterday when 5 presidents of the United States and 6 first ladies gathered with an overflow in an enthusiastic crowd on this spectacular hill to dedicate and open the doors of this even more spectacular Ronald Reagan Library. They were here to celebrate, actually in a bipartisan fashion. There were Democrats, one in particular, whom Ronald Reagan had defeated But they were here that day in bipartisan unity to celebrate the brilliant legacy that Ronald Reagan has bequeathed to us. And what was it? Well, it was a remarkably wise and beneficent climate of opportunity, a self-governance that gave us such a climate of opportunity, such unparalleled economic and military strength, that America emerged from a period of malaise and doubt as the unquestioned superpower in the world and the unquestioned champion of freedom in the world. And that was something that was of almost inexpressible importance to Ronald Reagan. Now, 25 years before that, 50 years ago today, on November 4th, 1966, as Ed has told you, Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California, and I was elected to the state legislature. Through the time that he was governor, at least some portion of it, I was the Republican whip in the Assembly, charged with responsibility for helping round up the votes to make certain that Ronald Reagan's policies became law. Well, later, when he was President of the United States, shortly thereafter, I followed him again. 2 years later, I was elected to the United States Senate, and as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was a staunch, vocal, enthusiastic exponent of Ronald Reagan's rebuilding of the American military and of our credibility in the free world, and I might say specifically of his famous policy of peace through strength. And then when Ronald Reagan left the Oval Office, when he came home to California, he did me the very high honor of chairing my candidacy for governor. And then, as you've heard, I had the privilege of presiding over the ceremony 25 years ago today that opened the doors on this structure. Ronald Reagan spoke that day. You've been listening to him, and by the way, I do know better than to try to follow Ronald Reagan. However, what he said was, as always, important. He did not dwell on the past. To the contrary, he barely mentioned his record of extraordinary success. Instead, he was looking forward. As you heard him say, he hoped and gave us the charge, those of us who became trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, the explicit charge, his wish, that this library become a place where scholars, quote, where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future. He was looking forward to the future. Well, I will be happy to tell you that the trustees of the foundation have taken to heart his wish. We have, in this building behind us, hosted numerous presidential debates. I think virtually every Republican candidate who has ever sought the office or thought about it has been a speaker in an endless parade of people who would be policymakers if they were successful. And Ronald Reagan would be very proud of what we have played. It was exactly what he hoped for, and even more. He would not only encourage, but strongly encourage that we go forward in what has been begun in our nation's capital, a new Ronald Reagan Institute. Now, the purpose of that institute is to apply the future challenges of future generations, the tested values which grounded his 8 years of life. And that's and let me tell you why. Lofty speeches are cheap. He was a brilliant orator. But he knew that what was important is that the words have real meaning, and the only way that could be demonstrated is by commitment and by action. So for those of us, whether in his administration or supporting him in the Congress, we learned that our mentor was a man of action, a man of decision. It was not just words to him, it was commitment translated into action. Because as a veteran of World War II, Ronald Reagan knew that evil exists and that weakness invites aggression. Somehow that lesson doesn't seem to be universally held today. And it is dangerous not to recognize it. But he knew it, and he also knew that domestically, those with perhaps good intentions, but eagerness for power, eagerness to make command and control decisions for ordinary citizens, were also a danger of overreaching by the executive and the Congress on occasion at the expense of freedom for the individuals. Well, Ronald Reagan's purpose and passion was freedom. It's not enough that his story be told in admiring books that go unread by the next generation on bookshelves, where they've not been prescribed reading by professors less admiring. It is important that this library and that the new Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. exist for future generations. These are not exercises in nostalgia. There are things in here that will make you laugh, things that will make you proud, but it is really for future generations that both of these institutions have come into being. It is for future generations and to inspire them as students of his life and his career and what he achieved, to keep alive Ronald Reagan's values and his dedication, his belief in an America where free men and women can grasp opportunity and create more. That was his mission, and it is ours. At this library and at the new Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington. So I thank you for being here this morning and for your support, because what we are doing and what you are doing is to help us sustain and keep faith with Ronald Reagan, his life, and his enduring vision for a strong and free America. God bless you and thank you.
"80 years is a long time to live, and yet within the course of only a few short years, I have seen the world turned upside down and conventional wisdom utterly disproved. Visitors to this mountaintop will see a great jagged chunk of that Berlin Wall, as you've been told already, hated symbol of, yes, an evil empire that spied on and lied to its citizens, denying them their freedom, their bread, even their faith. Well, today, that wall exists only in museums, souvenir collections, and the memories of a people no longer oppressed. It is also a reminder that a strong America is always desirable and necessary in our world."
Ladies and gentlemen, the 60th Secretary of State of the United States, the Honorable George Shultz.
When President Ronald Reagan took office, inflation was in the teens. The prime rate was in the 20s. The economy was going nowhere. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. President Carter, his predecessor, had cut off all contacts with the Soviet Union, even denying the traditional visit of Gromyko to Washington at the time of the General Assembly. The Cold War was as cold as it could get. When he left office, inflation was under control, the economy was doing great, and the Cold War was over but the shout, all over but the shouting. What did he bring to the party? Well, people say he was a great communicator, certainly. But he had ideas to communicate that turned out well. People call them conservative ideas. I call them common sense. So let me give you a couple of illustrations. He proposed a sweeping reform of the tax system. Wipe out all the preferences, lower the rates. Big deal. Nowadays, any big proposal like that, if it gets through, it gets jammed through. How do you do it? He's let it sit there. He knew that all tax legislation has to come out of the House. And that means it has to start in the Ways and Means Committee. So he worked with Danny Raskinkowski, who was the chairman, a Democrat. And out of it came a bill that was introduced in the House by Dick Gephardt, the Democratic leader. Over in the Senate, they produced a better bill. I think Bill Bradley, a Democrat, had the laboring oar in producing it. And out of the Committee of Reconciliation came pretty much the Senate bill. So it very much resembled President Reagan's original proposal. And it passed the Senate 97-3. So by the time he got through, it wasn't jamming something through the Congress. It was persuading people that this was a good idea and everybody should get behind it. It wasn't so much bipartisan as it was nonpartisan. Somebody asked him if it bothered him that 2 Democrats introduced this legislation. You know what he said? It passed, didn't it? So that's example one of how he got something done that was of vital importance and traditionally something very controversial, but went through 97-3. Now let's turn to the foreign policy side. When he took office, there was a great strain, in part because the Soviets had deployed what were called intermediate range nuclear weapons, INF weapons. And their strategic purpose was to deploy a weapon that hit Europe or hit Japan or hit China, but not us. And diplomatically, they were saying, we could attack one of your friends, but you wouldn't risk responding because your intercontinental missile would then be countered by our intercontinental missile, so you would lay off. That was their diplomatic ploy. So President Reagan proposed that we have a negotiation with 0 of these INF weapons on each side. At the time, they had 1,500 deployed. We had none deployed. People said it was ridiculous. But that's what we wanted, so that was his proposal. And then he worked very carefully with our NATO allies, and we developed a proposal that said, we will have a negotiation with the Soviets, and if it doesn't succeed, we will deploy our own intermediate range missiles in Europe to counter their diplomatic idea. You have to bear in mind that President Reagan broke with the conventional concepts that surrounded this relationship. There was the concept of détente. Détente said, you're here, we're here, you're there, that's life. The name of the game is to get along. He rejected that concept. He said, we're here, they're not permanent because they're inherently weak And they have problems of all kinds that in the end are going to cause them to change. Makes a big difference how you think of it. And then there was the concept of linkage. Anything bad happens in one area, everything else goes down. That's the concept that President Carter used to cut off all contacts. But when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner in the midst of our negotiations, we led the charge in condemning it. And actually, I had and read out in a press conference the transcript of the conversation between the Soviet fighter pilot who shot the plane down and his ground control. And there was some time elapsed, so we knew the ground control consulted with somebody, we didn't know who, but anyway, we had all that. So we sent our negotiators back to Geneva anyway, so we broke with linkage. That was critical in persuading our European allies that we were really serious in the negotiations because we had to have their support. In the end, the negotiations didn't succeed, and so we deployed. First in Britain, Margaret Thatcher supported us. Then in Italy, Andreotti did a good job. But then the big deal was Pershing missiles. These are ballistic missiles in Germany. And this was a gigantic event. But it was Helmut Kohl's finest hour. We got them deployed. And the Soviets pulled out of negotiations. They stimulated a lot of war talk. But we and our allies held firm. And as time went on, gradually, their volume went down as they saw we were standing firm. This was a massive show of strength, not a shot was fired. Ronald Reagan understood the difference between strength and use of force. Strength is more important. So there was an interesting little byplay on this. I was able to go to the president in August and say, Mr. President, 4 different capitals in Europe at a cocktail party, a Soviet diplomat has come up to one of ours and said virtually the same thing, which is if Gromyko is invited to Washington when he comes to the General Assembly, he'll accept. In other words, the Soviets blinked. I said, you want to think this over, Mr. President, because Jimmy Carter canceled these meetings when they went into Afghanistan and they're still there. He said, I don't have to think it over, let's get him here. So Gromyko came. And Nancy was sort of a pal with me. We had fun. And at White House dinners, she always fixed me up with a starlet for my dinner partner. So I got to dance with Ginger Rogers. How good is that? So I went to Nancy and I said, what the deal is, Gromyko is going to come to the West Wing. We'll have a meeting. Then we'll all walk down the colonnade to the mansion. That's your home. And they'll have some stand-around time. And then there's a working lunch. So I said, how about your being there at the stand-around time? You're the hostess. That'd be a nice gesture of hospitality. And she said, great idea. So she's there. Gromyko sees her. He goes right over to her. And after a little bit, he says to her, does your husband want peace? And Nancy, as you all know, could bristle. She said, of course my husband wants peace. Then he whispers, and he said, then whisper in his ear every night before he goes to sleep, peace. And he was a little taller than she was, so she put her hands on his shoulders and pulled him down so he had to bend his knee. She said, I'll whisper it in your ear, peace. I said, Nancy, you just won the Cold War. But this was a remarkable achievement. And the proposal that he got worked. There was some controversy about our proposal, but in the end, the Senate ratified the treaty 93-5. Once again, don't jam things through, persuade people that this is a great idea and get people on board. And that was his trademark. So I say, Ronald Reagan, please come back.
I, too, have been described as an undying optimist, always seeing a glass half full when some see it as half empty. And yes, it's true. I always see the sunny side of life. And that's not just because I've been blessed by achieving so many of my dreams. My optimism comes not just from my strong faith in God, but from my strong and enduring faith in man. And I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and that there is purpose and worth to each and every life.
Well, what wonderful remarks by all four. I'd like to start a round of applause for just four absolutely terrific men. Well, now on to the final part of today's program. In June of 2015, a heroic statue of Ronald Reagan was unveiled in California's state capitol. The statue's sculptor, Doug Van Hout, was a close friend of President Reagan and served as a White House artist during the administration. Doug used hundreds of photographs to make the image that became this statue. The group that commissioned the statue made two statues, and the second one is the one we're about to unveil. The Sacramento statue represents the only California governor to ever become president of the United States, and we are proud that its sister statue now has a permanent home at the Reagan Library. We're honored to have Doug with us today, and we want to thank you, Doug, for this extraordinary addition to our library grounds. In preparing for these remarks, I came across something Secretary Shultz said to reporters at the 2015 unveiling, and I wanted to share them with you today because they really encapsulate what we're celebrating today. The Secretary said, quote, "Ronald Reagan is alive for all of us because his ideas last." Why do his ideas last? Well, because they work. And with that, I would now like to invite each of our program's participants to go over to the statue and to help us with the unveiling. David, go right ahead. General, if you want to come over to that side. David.
Have you come forward just a little bit for me?
Okay. There you are. Okay, gentlemen, on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Doug?
If tomorrow all the things are gone I worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, for the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, when at least I know I'm
free, and I won't forget those who died to give that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston and New York to LA. There's pride in every American heart, and it's time to stand and say, to be an American where we stand alone free. And I won't forget those who died, leave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget those who died, leave them right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
That concludes this portion of the program here in the Rose Garden. Thank you for attending this special unveiling of this beautiful statue. We'll now be moving over to the courtyard, and please enjoy this 25th. Yes? No? Thank you.